Let's talk about addiction, repetition, and prayer. When the world is chaotic, when it's unpredictable, when it's disturbed, the world no longer follows a regular pattern. Things are thrown at you that you didn't expect, that you weren't mentally prepared for. So much of our perception is not actually the meticulous arrangement of eye pixels. This is how we analogize our vision in the 21st century as we think, I look at a camera, see the shape of the camera, and my mind is not doing anything metaphorical. We believe that vision is purely analytical. That is, we're directly perceiving quantitative data. And there is some of that, no doubt. The brightness and the color and so on and so forth. But our perception of shapes and objects and our identification of shapes and objects has to do so much with our imagination. You wouldn't believe. You wouldn't believe until you become severely dehydrated or malnutritioned, you're having a fast, you're sleep deprived, and then you start to hallucinate. You start to perceive objects in your peripheral vision, which you're not getting a lot of analytical data from, but you're imaginatively creating and seeing creatures or human beings in the corner of your eye that aren't really there. Now, the vision, which is an imaginative process and not purely a process of empirical data collection, as we think our sense data is just empirical, right? Well, almost we would think that the sense data would be the most empirical thing that there really could be. But it's actually much less empirical than we believe. It's very much influenced by imagination and perception, conceptualization, and language. So what does this diatribe on vision have to do with our overall perception of reality and the way that we deal with stress and disturbance and chaos? Well, the way our vision works is a microcosm of a macrocosm of our overall mental perception. That the way that we perceive the world and things happening, events happening, think about a conversation, think about a monologue, think about the way that you're listening to the words, think about the way that we perceive language. We like to believe that we are listening to every single word and analytically, exactly perceiving the full meaning of each individual word, and then through some kind of lightning fast process, we are then taking those words and stringing them together and making phrases and parsing out little sentences and paragraphs and extracting meaning here and there. But one example of how this is not necessarily the case, or there's an additional element we're not looking at, is with scrambled letters in a word. If you take a word like hippopotamus, it begins with an H, it ends with an S. You take all the guts of that word, the I, the P, the O, the T, the A, the M, the U, and you mix them all around so that instead of hippopotamus, you get hempotuminous. I don't know. I can't think of it. I don't have that imaginative power. But you can play around with it, and you can play around with sentences, and you can play around with paragraphs. And what you'll find is that as long as the first letter and the last letter are the same, doesn't matter if you mix up all the letters in between, we can still read that. I maybe I should have had a demonstration prepared for you. You can look it up. You can pause the video. You can look it up. So what is this demonstrating? It's demonstrating that we aren't necessarily looking at things objectively. We aren't looking at things in themselves. Now, there are certain practices related to Buddhism and Eckhart Tolle and the power of now, and you're just in the moment, and you're not creating narratives in your head about your sensory perception. You're simply experiencing, you're listening to the sound of your lungs breathing, you're listening to your heart beating, and you're listening to the rustling of the leaves and the chirping of the birds, and you're listening to the wind, and you're feeling the wind on your skin, and you're feeling those occasional itches that we get. And oh, now my face is itching now that I talk about that. Isn't that interesting? Our language draws attention to an aspect of the sensory apparatus, and it actually creates and invents sensation where previously there would have been no sensation. If I didn't talk about my itchy face, I wouldn't have felt my itchy face. And this becomes very uncomfortable, doesn't it? This concentration, this hyper focus that happens when we engage in this narrative building. Now, that's important. Language is important. Language would not exist if it didn't have some kind of advantage. So language allows for us to hyperfocus. And hyperfocus is the origin of addiction. It's the origin of religion. It's the origin of our ability to cope with stressful situations. But it's also the ability for us to conceive of regularity and patterns. And by conceiving of regularity and patterns, we have the ability to predict the future. Those are powerful things. So our ability to use language and thinks in terms of language, which is this imaginative narrative string, this thread, our ability to do that lays the groundwork for neurosis and addiction and this feeling of things are not right in the world and we need to do something about it. It creates this anxiety, right? Or we can create depression, we can create despair, we can create suffering. We can hyper-focus on these things in a way that animals with lesser mimetic communication systems, that is, they're not as mimetically developed, they're not able to hyper-focus as much as we do. And so our ability to hyper-focus is our greatest strength as human beings. It means that a man can spend 20 years trying to solve a math problem. An animal couldn't do that, and the animal sort of just lives according to the rhythms of the hormonal system and life at large and can't really deviate from that very much. We're able to dedicate our entire lives to very specific problems, which allows for specialization, which allows for civilization. And civilizations have a huge competitive advantage over, an animal tribe. So there's no way out of this. We have to confront it. We're living within this linguistic space. We have to understand that hyper-focus, well, it's going to be here. What are we going to hyper-focus on? I was thinking about the rosary. The rosary is not analytical. You cannot solve math problems when you're praying. Now, prayer might help you solve math problems, but those are two different things. Analysis during prayer is impossible. But prayer prior to analysis actually may strengthen our analytical powers. Because the hyper-focus of the brain can pay attention to the wrong things. For instance, we create an identity. We create an identity that says, I am X, Y, and Z. I am a good worker. And because I'm a good worker, I'm going to work hard at my job, and because I'm going to work hard at my job, I'm going to try to figure out what my boss wants, what the coworkers want, what the customer wants, how to solve these problems. And because I'm trying to solve these problems, I'm going to read a book about it, or I'm going to hyper-focus on something, whether it's a social problem, an analytical problem, whatever. I'm going to hyper-focus. And so the way that we pay attention, the way that we focus on different tasks is determined by a narrative of identity. Our identity informs, it creates this kind of tree of potentiality that allows us to then go down all these decision routes and arrive at whatever we're focusing on at any particular moment. So I'll say I'm a video maker, and so I'll think of ideas for videos, and I'll make videos, and I'll prepare for the video, or whatever I do. Why am I a video maker? Well, that's expressing some personality trait. So it's these very basic characteristics of identity formation that lead to very specific outcomes and focuses. Now, supposedly all the stuff I've just talked about is good, right? I'm a hard worker, I do good at my job, and that leads me to specialize in a very particular way. It leads me to allow a kind of emotional weight to a given task that otherwise would seem kind of inane, dry, boring, right? People can actually have fun working on what the vast majority of the population would consider to be completely boring, but people can have fun. I mean, there are people who can have fun building model train sets and so on. I mean, just things that are so monotonous and for some people mind numbing and not stimulating at all. For some people, that can be a joyful activity, a pleasurable activity, an activity they look forward to, an activity they use their limited free time to engage in. So our judgment of where to put our focus and what makes us feel like we're in that flow zone, we're doing the thing we're supposed to be doing, we're solving the problem, we're working the work, we're doing the thing, our ability to feel that way about any particular given subject has so much to do with our identity. So when people pray the rosary, they're not engaging in analysis. They're not saying, oh man, let me figure out how to pray the rosary. Let me derive the rosary from base principles. Let me reconstruct the rosary. Let me, encrypt it and decrypt it. It's rote repetition. This is a feature of many religions. And the Protestants try to get away from it. They try to say, oh, don't do vain repetitions. Well, repetitions aren't necessarily vain. I mean, that is, I understand the idea that people really can, say things over and over again. They're not getting that deeper meaning that should be there. They're mouthing the words, and then they're not living up to the principles that are meant to be instantiated by those words, and that's a problem. But repetition in itself is calming. Repetition in itself has a reset effect. When we expect the world to be a certain way, and it doesn't turn out that way, and it's not predictable, and it's confusing, and it's surprising, all of this, we're very, as much as we're adaptive as human beings, and they're all, everything I'm talking about here is ultimately an adaptive system, but it's not a perfect system, right? We're not all masters of this system. If we were, then we wouldn't see addictions in the world. So addictions are a consequence of what happens when you take away the rosary and people are like, well, I need something, when I'm stressed, when I'm disturbed, when I'm perturbed and I'm surprised and I'm in an emotional funk and things aren't regular and I don't know what the future's going to be and I'm stressed and I'm anxious and I'm despairing because I don't feel like I have agency. I don't feel like I have control. I feel like I'm being whipped around in the wind. I feel like I'm lost at sea. How do I press the reset button? How do I get back to calm? How do I get back to a certainty? How do I get back to an orientation about the world so that I have an idea of what that decision tree is so I can focus on what the heck am I supposed to be doing right now? Am I supposed to be making this video, or are there a million other things I could be doing? If we're caught in that chaos of a moment where we have no clue what we're supposed to be doing, and that induces a kind of paralysis, and it becomes insurmountable at a point because the imagination, which is so powerful and helpful to us, then creates these mountains out of molehills. And something where it's like, look, we can stress out about a situation or we can accept it for what it is and move on and move forward. we can talk about all the problems in the world and we can be honest about them, but then we have to try our best. But people get stuck. People get stuck in this transition phase where you're introducing all of these harsh realities, and that produces a kind of irregularity. So, how do people deal with that? Traditionally, the way people deal with that is through repetitious prayer or through ritual. You see this so much in Judaism because Judaism was really a pioneer in this field. Now, there are consequences, right? The Protestants point out that if you become too ritualistic, that it creates a kind of neuroticism. It creates a kind of hyper dependence upon ritualism. And you become so rigid in your application of ritual that you lose the spirit. I mean, not only the Protestants said that, but it's pretty clear that's what Jesus is saying when he says, look, you Pharisees, you are totally concerned with the letter of the law, and you're not at all concerned with the spirit of the law. And so something, again, that was adaptive, the concept of using ritual as a means of psychological anchoring and stabilizing for periods of extreme stress and irregularity, something that was absolutely necessary, then sort of turned on itself and became inflexible and became non-adaptive. And a lot of flaws and problems grew up out of that. You have so many laws and they're all inducing this hyper-focus, and you've created a kind of fragile system, right? You've created a system where there's 619 commandments and you have to hit every single one of those check boxes, otherwise you're living in sin. And it induces a kind of stress. It induces a kind of tension. And that stress and tension can eat away at us and prevent us from rolling with the punches, so to speak. Because really there was something monumental going on during the time of Christ. You had a monumental change in this urban environment of the Mediterranean, this Roman cultural expansion, which was following this Greek cultural expansion, which was then melding into ultimately what would become a German cultural expansion that was in the works, slowly kind of burrowing underground and biding its time. Slowly the iceberg building up there of that German cultural expansion, which you could see already at that time, but which was not kinetic. It was purely potential, growing up over time. Those sorts of cultural expansions were creating these radical stressors on localized cultures. And, so the Jews were really feeling that. And some of them were just doubling down. They were like, look, we have a system of ritualism that protects us psychologically. It's a kind of armor. It protects us psychologically. When we have a problem, we go back to our rituals. It resets us. It clears the mind. It allows us to think analytically. And as things were changing so much, some people doubled down on that. And then some people, like not just the Christians, but prior to the Christians, you had some people, the Essenes. Essenes. I wonder what the Greek pronunciation is. I wonder if it is a Greek word. It sounds Greek to me, the Essenes. People who were like, let's just get out of society. Let's go off into the woods and do that kind of Buddhist meditation. There's different sort of levels to that Buddhist meditation where, and of course it's not Buddhist meditation, that's not accurate to say, because Buddhism does not have a conception of, praying to a deity, to an entity, to a personality. But this concept of constant prayer, that prayer is no longer the exception. See, the way I've presented prayer so far is I've said, prayer is something we do when we become so stressed that we can't handle it and our system's shut down and everything's, red alert. And so prayer is something that we do to stop and reset and go, Okay. All right. Let's stop freaking out and let's create a clearing. Let's part these chaotic waters and let's find a path forward. So that's one way of thinking about prayer, and I think that's valid. But then this other way of thinking about prayer that then starts to come into play when things get so chaotic in the Mediterranean is that people are like, we need to pray unceasingly. We need to be constantly praying. We need to pray like every aspect of our life needs to be in some way a prayer, which I think does, connect with, the Buddhist tradition, the concept of this constant awareness, right? In this constant state of awareness where you're not. It seems to be contradictions from both ends to me, because on the one hand, you're not directly perceiving anything. That is, you're not reacting, right? When something happens, you don't react to it. You sort of allow it to pass through you, and you're then thinking with pure consciousness. You're no longer thinking in this reactive mode. Something happens, you're not fearful, right? There's a loud bang, there's a loud noise. You don't scream, you don't run around, you don't start crying. No, a loud noise has happened. We allow that sort of pass through us, and we get into that mode of pure consciousness. We don't allow that reactive animal brain to engage. We restrain it, we ignore it, we suppress it. It's interesting to talk about. It's hard to talk about vegetarianism because, I think there's different kinds of dietary effects. I mean, what seems to be clear to me is that the animal mind, the animal part of the human brain, is really meant to run on meat, and the body performs really well with meat. You can take a man, and if you're just feeding people just pure meat, no carbs, no sugars, just pure protein, and then of course you want some vegetables. You want your vitamins, so you're going to eat some vegetables. But if you just completely cut out the carbs and sugars, the body performs so well, and you can just eat so much protein and stay extremely lean because it's giving you this energy that is not easily converted into fat. Sugars and carbs are easily converted. So in terms of creating an athletic, lean body, in terms of building muscle, the density of protein in meat is, you just can't match it in terms of, non-meat products, unless you're going synthetic, in which case it's like, that's not very natural. But there's that argument, but then, and that's part of the reason why I'm eating meat. But then there is an argument to be made that as much as meat helps the animal brain and helps the animal body and helps us develop our physical power, if you want to be striving for pure consciousness, you really want to suppress that, right? You want to have not necessarily the most frail and weak body possible, although we see the Buddha does get to that point, and not the big belly Buddha, but actually the skinny, emaciated Buddha, which is really more, traditional, authentic to the original teachings. The emaciated form is not necessarily what happens when you go vegetarian, but you're not feeding. I mean, this is just related to testosterone levels. I mean, we know that meat increases your testosterone levels. We know that cutting it out decreases that. And what does testosterone do? It makes you more aggressive. It makes you more violent. It makes you more assertive, and it makes you able to make quick decisions in the moment. It gives you confidence. It's related to your ability to project into social situations. It's related to all of these things. And it is, what is the inverse then? Or what is the dark side of all those positive qualities? Is it's reactive, right? It's engaging with your animal charisma. and your basic instincts, right? What are the basic instincts? Sex, physicality, athleticism, sociality. Those are like the basic things that, our ape ancestors needed to do. We needed to be able to put on mating displays, and we needed to be athletic. And so eating meat, I think, connects us with that. But if you want to be disconnected with that, if you say, well, I don't want to focus on those things. I don't want to focus on being reactive. I don't want to be aggressive. I don't want to be violent. I don't want to be someone who is engaging in mating displays all the time. Because I don't want to focus on what is, genetically beneficial for myself. I want to think outside of that. I want to think in terms of universals. So that's a little bit of an aside on vegetarianism. Maybe related to something about hyperfocus here. Is this video itself an example of a lack of hyperfocus because I can't stay on the topic of prayer and addiction? And I forget what the third phrase was. Is that an example of a lack of hyperfocus, or am I so hyperfocused that I become so attentive to the words that I'm saying that a word reminds me of a certain thing, and I become so hyper-focused on a new topic that I can't remember the general thread of the video? That's an interesting question. It's possible that there's like parallel mental processes going on at the same time that are contradicting each other. But people need ritual. People need repetition. And if that ritual and repetition is aligned and is in harmony with our greatest possible identity, right? Bringing it back to identity. If our ritual and our repetition and our prayer is always pointing us back to the perfect, eternal, and the infinite, it's always pointing us toward the ideal, toward God, toward the whole, toward understanding the long term, not the short term, toward putting aside our immediate reactions and understanding what is true, putting aside our emotions and trying to be objective. If our ritual and repetition and our prayer is pointing toward that kind of identity where we're identifying with the divine, we're identifying with the higher man, the consciousness, then there's an advantage to that. And we see that in traditional societies. We see societies under pressure in the past. They had to mobilize themselves in that way. But what we see now is that those things are kind of passing away, but we're not losing repetition. We're not losing, in a sense, worship and prayer. But the form of it has become very different because it's pointed toward a different identity. It's not pointed toward that higher identity of consciousness I talked about before. But it's now pointed toward a lower identity of reactivity and the base animal instinct. So what repetitions do we have? Well, drug use is a repetitive form of worshiping the drug when you're in a drug addiction. And one of the interesting things that people start reporting, and I think it's very interesting, you see this across different addictions. It shows we have a religious mind embedded in us. That one of the most addictive things about these addictions, whether it's a drug addiction or a sex addiction or a porn addiction or a food addiction or a TV addiction or a social media addiction, whatever kind of addiction we're talking about, that oftentimes there are little processes that are ancillary to these addictions. So when you're preparing the drugs, you're cutting up the whatever, you're parsing it out, you're rolling the paper. There are different drugs, you're going to do different things. You're going to prepare the needle. You're going to wrap up your arm. So there's all sorts of different things. You're going to do all these things in preparation. And what people have found, I think there's some scientific evidence and also some kind of anecdotal evidence, that the preparatory steps of this ritual have in themselves a kind of anticipatory dopamine rush, that the brain is so imaginative that it imagines the dopamine rush it's about to get from this drug, which we think is this objective biochemical dopamine rush. But it's actually our imagination saying, I think this drug is going to be awesome. And I know that this ritual of preparation going into that drug is going to necessarily lead to me taking that drug, and therefore I'm going to flood the brain with dopamine before we've even taken the drug. And this, I think, is true, again, for sex and porn and food and social media and any other thing that people can be addicted to. That actually the preparatory steps, people talk all about that before you put the cake in your mouth, it tastes better. The anticipation of the cake, as I'm gonna go to the store, I'm gonna buy this cake, and you're going through the guilt process. I'm gonna buy this cake, I know I shouldn't. And you get it home and you start cutting the cake. And so when you're cutting the cake, your dopamine levels might even be higher. I mean, maybe the first bite is really the climax, right? That first bite. But really, that's where you've hit your high, at that first bite. And everything from there is downhill. Everything from there is like, I don't like this. Your guilt's taking over. Each and every bite desensitizes your taste buds. Each bite is not as good as the last bite. I'm not telling people to just stop eating food entirely. We're all addicted to food in the sense that we do it every day. It's a ritual for us. So I'm not trying to say that rituals are bad, but we should be aware of our rituals. We should be aware of how we ritualize our lives. What do we do? How do we conduct ourselves? Who are we worshiping? What are we worshiping? Because we're worshiping something. This is, people say there's no atheists in foxholes. Well, there's no atheists in his mom's basement. There's no atheists in a college dorm. There's no atheists in, some kind of very mediocre, banal place. There's no atheists anywhere, because you're engaging in ritual that is connected with an identity. Whether you understand that or not, whether you're cognizant or conscious of it, we are so repetitive as human beings. Again, our eating, it's repetitive. But our consumption of media is repetitive. And all these other things become repetitive as well. I mean, partying is repetitive. There's not much analytical or mathematical about partying. You get drunk, inebriated, high, whatever. Dancing is repetitive. Right? These are not math problems we're solving here. I don't know if I fully implanted the idea I wanted to implant in your head here. Just that, I suppose when people try to quit smoking, it's very hard to quit smoking. What makes it a lot easier is when you replace that addiction with something else. So people use the patch. But you can also use something like every time you want to smoke, you take out your notepad and you start writing. I want to smoke so bad because my day is going crappy so far and I just want to smoke, and I've been smoking for 13 years, and you start to write it out, and that becomes a ritual. And then that becomes a replacement for the smoking itself, because you're achieving the ritual. I should have brought that up. The smoking, the way people, everything that happens in the smoking process. I'm not a big smoker, so I'm not intimately familiar with it, but I've heard smokers describe the smoking process, and the whole thing, it becomes a ritual for them. It becomes comforting for them. Not just the nicotine, right? Not just the chemical dependence, which is a thing in itself, but there's all this psychological and imaginative structure around it. And we're going to live addicted, ritualistic lives. No one is going to have a life where every single day is perfectly unique and different from the next. Most of our lives are going to be, I would even say all of our lives. I would say there's almost no one who's ever existed where each day was just completely unique. There's a uniqueness to every day, but there's also a regularity. Whether that regularity is every day I watch Netflix, every day I am watching, 20 episodes of Netflix. Whether that would be like 10 hours or something, maybe more. Every day, I drink my fruit juice because it tastes so good. I can't live without it. Or it might be worse than fruit juice. It might be every day I gotta drink my soda. coffee's not that bad for you. For some people, it's, it has different effects on different people, but not really that bad. But some people say, I'm dependent on my coffee. I got to drink my coffee. So we're all going to have rituals. But we have to be critical of our rituals, and we have to ask ourselves, is this bringing me toward the kind of identity I want to have? Whether it's the coffee or the cigarettes or the food choices or any of these drug addictions, the way that we interact with urbanism and sociality and social media, the way we interact with sexuality, our relation to all these things, it becomes sort of necessarily ritualistic. There's no way to escape that. Even studying has a ritualism to it. I mean, we could bring up a million examples because this is just the structure of the human mind, so it's kind of universally applicable. I think once we become aware of this, then, the mass doesn't seem so silly anymore. I think there are a lot of people who look at the mass and they say, oh, well, like a traditional Catholic mass, you're doing the same thing every time. You're saying the same thing. And you're saying it in Latin, if it's an old-fashioned traditional Latin liturgy, it's like you're saying things that people don't even understand. It's like, what's the point here? It's a ritual. So we have to understand the power of ritual. Understand the power of myth. And sort of myth is this connecting thing between the ritual itself and the identity that ritual points toward. That there's that mythic structure in there. So being aware of that, and saying that there's no such thing as quitting an addiction. There's no such thing as becoming a non-addicted person. Everyone's addicted. But some people's addictions point toward higher identities, and some people's addictions point toward lower identities. Some people are addicted to success. Some people are addicted to money. Some people are addicted to academia and academics and scholasticism and scholarship. And some people are fully addicted to athletics. Any professional athlete is full on addicted to that sport, 100%. Is that bad? Is that evil? Is that wrong? No, that's awesome that person is addicted to that sport, so long as that identity is good for them. So long as that's suitable and good for them. Maybe there are cases where it's not working out so well. And we can be critical of that. But we can sort of rank these, and we can look at them, we compare them, and we can see that different identities, not everyone's going to have the same exact identity. So some people are going to have a more athletic identity, and therefore the athletic addiction is going to suit that identity. And some people are going to have a more, maybe money-oriented identity, and their addictions to watching the stock market and networking and doing all the things you need to make money, that's going to work toward that identity. And other people are going to be focused on, spiritual matters and the truth. making YouTube videos an addiction. So I think different people, as I've said, sort of everything is addictive. Everything is ritual. You can't escape it. You replace your cigarette smoking with your journal writing. You replace your journal writing with a daily sport practice. You replace your daily sport practice with gambling or something like that. We're just sort of switching these out and balancing them. It's sort of a juggling act. And as we're doing this, I think some people are a little more relaxed about the whole thing. I think some people don't, because I think animals do have an addictive potentiality. I think animals can become addicted to things, and I think animals do have the capacity for ritual. But when we talk about this hyperfocus and the abstraction of hyperfocus, where sometimes you get artists who are addicted to art. You get an artist who's so addicted to his painting that he won't eat for 7 days because he just is like, he'll just like stop sleeping and stop eating because he's just painting. He's in a, we call it a mania. He's in a manic episode. It's not happy. But he's in a energetic wind tunnel. I mean, he's just hyper focused on this artistic task. And maybe that's why I can do such long videos, just because I'm hyper focused on the video. And in the same way that the painter doesn't want to stop painting, I don't want to stop making the video. Not necessarily that it's a good video, it's just I'm hyper focused on it. So I think some people don't have that capacity because that requires a level of abstraction and identification, where the artist has, through the power of his imagination, he has taken the painting and he has made it into a god. And this is, I think, disturbing for, run-of-the-mill monotheistic people, because it's like, wait a second, if you start calling paintings gods, then you get into like some pantheistic territory there. But I don't think I think the distinctions that we'd like to make are obscuring some of the picture. That a painter is a man who can become obsessive about painting because he can worship the art. He can see the divinity in the art. Maybe this is bringing it back to the monotheism. He can see the divinity in the art, and so he has a passion and he has a pursuit of it. Whereas an average person cannot, through power of imagination and abstraction, envision and fully become sensitive to the divinity of painting. And therefore, the average person is not going to spend thousands and thousands of hours perfecting their artistry, perfecting their craft. And so people who are masters, people who perfect a craft, who become excellent in their field, these are people who have sensitivity to an identity, to an identification of a process, of a craft, a skill, an art, a life path, a life ritual, a religion, right? In a sense, the artist is a religious man. His religion is the divinity of art, of artwork. And it instantiates itself in different forms in the same way that the priest instantiates himself in various masses. All of which have similarity to one another, but which have their own unique differences. And we can see that just as a priest or even a church as a whole will present a certain ritual of religion, the painter has a certain style. We call it a style. And the regularity, the theme that ties all of the works together. That's his style. That's his signature characteristic. That is his personality in his artwork. So most people, I don't think, have the sensitivity to be able to see the divinity in the artwork to the point where they're willing to engage in a kind of addiction in pursuit of that artwork. But most people do, and in fact, I would say all people do have the potentiality to engage in addiction to things which are not really divine, which you require no sensitivity, right? We can all develop a drug addiction. I mean, some people can try drugs and say, oh, I never got addicted. I tried it once. The worst ones being, I suppose, like meth and heroin. I mean, I'm sure there are people out there who said, yeah, I tried meth, I tried heroin. Tried it once, wasn't for me. Didn't get addicted. A lot of people get addicted the first time. So that is when you get addicted to meth, when you get addicted to heroin, there's no sensitivity right there. There's no ability to perceive the divinity in the craft. No, you're just like, it's just a pure dopamine rush in your brain. It's just pure brain chemistry at that point. And so anyone can become a professional meth user. You can spend 10,000 hours becoming a master of meth. But that's pretty pathetic, right? I think we'd all understand that the identity of a meth user is not something that we should move toward. we should move away from that. Whereas the identity of the artist is good because it brings us closer to divinity. The identity of the athlete is good because it's pointing in that divine direction. So I think then the next step becomes, how do we increase our sensitivity? How do we increase our awareness? How do we increase our discernment as individuals, but also collectively? How do we start making a shift away from addictions that push us down into meth level identity, or at least are pointed in that direction? And how do we turn that ship around? And how do we point toward addictions that are passions, that are rituals, that are religions, that are practices, you could say, that are pushing in that higher direction of a kind of mastery, of power, of something that is sensitive to the subtleties of the world, of something that is not even necessarily complex, but something that has a higher order to it, right? It's not just like sewage. You know, the meth identity, it's like sewage. It's like, water just finding the lowest point or something. Things getting to the lowest vibration. I was a little bit confused with that metaphor, low vibration versus high vibration, but maybe that's kind of what it's referring to. Water going to its lowest point, the lowest vibration, versus high vibrational energies, which are not necessarily complex, but which have a kind of tension to them, which have a subtlety to them, which have a fragility to them. Like, what is more impressive? Taking a bunch of mud and making a mud ball, or taking, little splinters of glass and creating a snowflake, a beautiful snowflake, right? And there can be complexity in that. I suppose really what we're looking at, what is the differentiation between a block of coal and a diamond? People always talk about the heat and pressure part, but the molecular structure of the coal is disordered. It's chaotic. It's irregular. The diamond is regular. It is patterned. It's not necessarily very complex. In fact, the diamond is simpler than the coal, because the diamond has regularity. Therefore, to mathematically model a diamond structure on a molecular basis, we actually have to do less mathematics, because we can use patterning and recursion to eliminate aspects of the model, or to condense aspects of the model. We can say, look, there's going to be a, whatever it is, hexagonal structure, I'm not sure, but there's some kind of geometric structure in the diamond that is regular and that it repeats. Whereas the block of coal, the carbon's just every which way, all over the place, and therefore it's very complex. And so to accurately model that coal, there's two things you can do. You can either exactly model it, which takes a lot of data, because you've got billions or trillions of atoms or something, or you can just do an approximation. You can take the outer geometric structure of the coal, which is going to be irregular and rough, or you can just randomize it, right? If I show you a diamond, I say this is a diamond, and then I show you carbon fiber tubing, which also has a regularity and a geometry to it, and I say, are these two the same? You say, absolutely not. But if I take two completely different blocks of coal, and I say, are these pretty much the same? Yeah, I mean, you could show somebody a block of coal, hide it behind your back, pull out a new one and say this is the same one, and you'd say, well, they both look kind of irregular. We're kind of getting back to the concept of vision, right? Where when things are clear and concise and simple, we can discern the distinctions between those objects. But when objects are completely random and chaotic, they all sort of appear the same. Kind of getting into a Dionysian form as opposed to an Apollonian form. We've hit about 50 minutes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.